help us understand the significance of this electoral victory.
This is huge. First of all, people should understand that Colombia has never had a left-wing government, ever. In the history of Colombia as a nation state for about 150 years. And now the president-elect, Gustavo Petro, and his vice president, Francia Marquez, who we should definitely talk about her as well, because her politics are even better. The president is a former guerrilla, Gustavo Petro. He has promised to invest in expanding healthcare and education. He has also talked about land reform, which has never happened in Colombia, and the land issue is a major part of what has been driving violence in Colombia for decades. And he has also called for sitting down and having dialogue for actual peace. The fact that he is himself a former guerrilla, in his youth, he fought in a revolutionary socialist organization called M19, is very significant. Now, I don't want people to get their hopes too high. Gustavo Petro, he's not Hugo Chavez. He's not a revolutionary. He's not talking about socialism. During his campaign, he repeatedly reassured people, I'm not going to expropriate properties. I'm not going to, take away the wealth of rich people. I respect private property. But, you have to have baby steps. And in a country like Colombia that has never had a left-wing government, this is very historic. And it's also very important for the region. I live in Nicaragua. I've been to Colombia several times. I've reported in Colombia. I've interviewed people whose families have been destroyed by the violence in Colombia. Throughout the region, Colombia has been a destabilizing factor, and especially for Venezuela, which is the neighbor of Colombia. They have a massive several thousand kilometer border. I mean, that is a huge influence on the violence that the people of Venezuela have been suffering from. Colombia not only has had this problem of paramilitary groups and death squads linked to the state, but also Colombia has even backed numerous cross-border attacks in Venezuela, including, what people jokingly call Bay of Piglets. People might remember in May 2020, the U.S. government, the Donald Trump administration, backed an attempted invasion of Venezuela. Well, that invasion was carried out from inside Colombian territory using fighters who were trained in Colombia. So in terms of the repercussions across the region, this is a very significant victory.
Yeah, you mentioned that Petro assured people during his campaign there wasn't going to be any expropriation of land. I was reading that 50% of the land is owned by 1% of the people, and it's the indigenous and Afro-Colombian populations that are most pointedly affected by that distribution. There was this moment during his remarks, election night, when he was on the stage, surrounded by, a crowd of people. And he said, we're going to uphold capitalism, or something to that regard. And I don't know if I'm imagining it, but it seemed like Marquez, his VP, kind of tensed, and he reached out and touched her arm almost reassuringly. And then he went on to say, it's not because, we love capitalism or what have you, but it's because we want to, we need to advance the country and get past feudalism and those kinds of things. But it seemed to be an interesting visual contrast between those two and their politics. Ajamu, am I right to say that you have a relationship with Marquez, that you know her?
I know Francia very well since she was a teenager. Yes, and so she did tense up because it's a very delicate dance that they are involved in Colombia. Very, very complex, and Petro, being the politician that he is pursuing a strategy which he believes that that these kinds of reassurances will provide some breathing space for the new administration. He understands, like Francia clearly understands, that the electoral win is just the first phase. That the struggle really will intensify now, because the right, they're not going to want to allow him to govern. Secondly, there will be some underhanded policies and behaviors that they're going to have to deal with, extra legal behaviors that they're going to have to deal with. So trying to at least neutralize some potential opposition. I think is a strategy that he's trying to pursue. But I think he understands, like everybody, that the politics in Colombia are such that there are demands coming from the base, coming from the bottom up, that are requiring that they do make some more than just incremental changes. They are going to have to begin to address the contradictions of the economy, the role of the oligarchy, and they're going to have to do this and be relatively aggressive in doing it. So it is a very complex situation. Petro is not pursuing or not articulating a revolutionary program, but the base of support is a base that is pushing and will be pushing for real changes, not just symbolic changes.
So help me understand how they even manage this, because I was listening to a pair of journalists on, I think it was on Democracy Now!, and they were explaining that this isn't the first time there's been a real kind of left upsurgence and an appetite for this. There was an assassination of the left candidate in, what was it, 1948. And that is a real concern here. People were not surprised that Petro was as popular as he was, but that he was actually successful in winning, because there are mechanisms in place that have so often successfully derailed left candidates, including extra legal methods that you alluded to, Ajamu. So, Ben, how did they land this one?
Yeah, I mean, so specifically, people should understand, that there's a long history of assassinations that continues to this day. You were talking about the assassination of the very important leftist leader, Jorge Eliezer Gaitan, who was supposed to be president and was assassinated. And, that was decades ago, but still today, every single year in Colombia, hundreds of activists are killed. And in fact, according to civil society organizations that monitor this, in 2021, there were 96 massacres. So that just last year alone. The year before that, there were nearly 100 massacres. This year, there have already been dozens of massacres. And these are massacres of land defenders, Afro-Colombians, indigenous nations, and labor organizers. If you have a progressive bone in your body, and especially if you live in a rural area, it's very dangerous. And that's because, as you acknowledged, Briahna, such an important factor of this is the concentration of land in the hands of a few capitalists. These big multinational corporations are trying to exploit land. I should say that, Coca-Cola has been implicated in this and using death squads to kill labor organizers. So this is not even just the Colombian oligarchy, which is very bloody and notorious, but also foreign corporations that are trying to exploit Colombia's very plentiful resources. And both Petro and Marquez, we should stress that Francia Marquez is from a rural area. He represents the Afro-Colombian community, that they have talked about the importance of land reform, because the country has been so devastated by violence. And the fact that Petro was himself an armed guerrilla, I mean, again, he still doesn't have the politics these days of an armed guerrilla. He understands how the game is played. He was the former the former mayor of the capital, Bogota. So he's been mayor before. That's a very mainstream establishment position. People know that he's not planning on overthrowing the state and, implementing socialism or whatever. But as someone who comes from that background as a guerrilla, he understands why people in Colombia have taken up arms. And it's because they have no other option but to take up arms, because they're being killed. And Francia Marquez intimately understands that. In fact, she was invited to speak in the United States at the so-called U.S. Institute for Peace, a very ironically named U.S. government-backed agency. And she was interviewed in the heart of Washington. And very bravely, I would say, very admirably, she spoke up about this. And she said, look, we need to be honest. The U.S. government has a history of carrying out these policies of militarization through Plan Colombia that have only made the violence worse. She said that we need to talk about how sending troops and paramilitaries to rural areas has only made the violence worse. She said every single day we're burying our loved ones and activists. And she said also another thing that we need to do is end the drug war, which is, of course, the issue of drugs is another major issue hanging over all of this.
Yeah, and I want to come back to that. But before we do, I want to drill down a little bit on this tension between President VP here, because it is, you're saying that Petro is kind of a center-left candidate, that he has been the mayor of Bogota and has kind of shed some of the kind of revolutionary valences, and that was very necessary for him to be able to get elected and to quite literally survive this whole process. And yet there is this VP choice that is so difficult to read as anything other than a nod to a more radical base that was really hungering for more substantial change. I was reading that this was an election enabled by both youth turnout and the fact that people from rural areas sometimes came on a multi-day trip by canoe from rural rainforest areas to vote. That there was that level of commitment. And so how it strikes me, because in the United States there was this expectation that let's say Bernie were to become president, that he would definitely pick a neolib as a VP. Like, there's this expectation he would pick the nicest version of a more moderate candidate. And we saw this even when it was Barack Obama, and many of us thought he was going to be better than he was. Not all of us. I know. I hear you, Cornel West, in my head saying, I knew the whole time. I hear you, my friend. But, went ahead and picked Joe Biden and cast a die for what we're all living with today. But that if it were the other way around, the centrist candidate, there's no expectations that they're ever going to select like a Bernie type as a VP. When Hillary won, there was no expectation. Of course, she wasn't going to pick Bernie. They never throw us that kind of a bone. So is it then meaningful, Ajamu? I mean, what do you make of her selection, especially given her background as an environmentalist, as a land right activist, and all of those kinds of things, which are difficult to kind of make seem less radical than they are? I mean, she is who she is.
Exactly. And they had the campaign had no other choice. So people have to understand that Francia Marquez became probably the most popular personality in the country, even more so in some ways over Petro. And you saw it on the campaign trail. So the million votes that she got in the primary. So I was one of the ones who thought that they might attempt to go a different direction. We knew that he had this propensity to want to reach out to other centrist forces to build a coalition in which he could, in fact, try to govern. But the politics of Colombia were such that he had no other choice. And you look at the results. Two things. People have to be reminded this is his third go around. Okay. And so what was the difference this time? Francia Marquez and the popular movements in Colombia. And you look at the results. They won the Caribbean coast. They won the Pacific coast. These are the places where you have, Afro-Colombian and indigenous populations. They came out in big numbers. Now, one of the things we need to remind people of is when people talk about indigenous, they talk about young people. For some reason, people tend to forget that the base of Francia's support and of this progressive tide in Colombia is, in fact, the Afro-Colombian communities, the Afro-Colombian peoples. Okay, so this
and they're a huge population. What did I read? That's like 40% of the country. Is that?
Well, it depends on who you talk to, because it's not really clear, because it's self-identification and there's the government census. But the point is this, with two things. Of course, they have the Colombia has the third largest African community outside of Africa. But secondly, they are a sophisticated political force. We haven't talked about, and we may not have time to talk about this, when we talk about the rebellion last year in 2021, that was a rebellion on the foundation of previous rebellions in 2019, but in particular, the rebellion that took place in Buenaventura, where the population, this is a city, 95% Afro-Colombian, they took the city and held that city for 22 days. 22 days. The last time that happened was the Paris Commune. Okay? So this is a population that can fill 20,000 people in 2 days. Okay? So, they had to respond to that reality, and the young people and the women, LGBTQ communities. She's the one that brought the fire. Okay, so it wasn't like well, let's give them a little something. No, Francia basically gave the presidency to Petro.
Interesting. Can you? How have you known her since she was a teenager?
I've been coming to Colombia since the early 1990s, when it was even hotter than it is today. And Francia is a member of a organization that I happen to be a member of also, the Black Community Process, PCN. She's not a politician. Francia is a creation of the movement. When there were issues in the campaign, there was a point there where there was a question whether or not the PCN folks, Francia at the top of it, were going to continue. Francia didn't have the ability to say, I'm pissed, I'm not going to participate. Oh, no. They had to call an assembly. And in that assembly, a decision was made to make certain adjustments, but the Francia will continue in the campaign. So this is not no jive candidate centered bourgeois politician. This is a movement representative representing a real concrete political force in Colombia.
So do you expect there to be, I mean, I don't know, maybe this is all very premature, but I don't know, do you expect there to be further tensions that arise between Petro and Francia because he feels pressure to, or is perhaps potentially co-opted into taking more of an establishment line that's to the right of where the people that elected this pair hoped for them to be? I'm thinking of, Yanis Varoufakis's resignation. I mean, how are you guys thinking about that? Or am I being just too premature?
Well, it's all right to think about it, but I think that we're going to see how the politics unfold. The portfolio that Francia has now is workable. Some people are concerned with the lack of gender diversity among the cabinet. It really remains to be seen. But the tensions are going to be dealt with. Petro, is a strategy that we're going to see how it unfolds. But there will be pressure coming from the bottom up if there aren't certain kinds of policies that are put on the table and realistically pursued. But people here are sophisticated enough to understand the limitations, to understand the pressures coming from the oligarchy and the international community, specifically the U.S. And so they'll be given a bit of a benefit of the doubt. But, who knows what may happen in about a year.
Yeah, so he doesn't have Congress. Right? What is it? He has 20 votes. Was I reading that, Benjamin? And so how many would he need to form a coalition that could pass legislation?
Well, he has 20%. So, it's going to be very difficult. What he's going to have to do is form some kind of broader coalition with more centrist parties. In fact, right now, today is June 24th. He's already begun this process of kind of negotiations with even the right wing, which is part of this process that I understand, and people on the left are wary of it, but Petro understands that the country is very divided, and he does want to have some kind of political reconciliation process. He's actually having talks with Alvaro Uribe, who's like the right-wing kingpin who has dominated Colombian politics for 20 years, and his party is called the Democratic Center, although it's neither democratic nor of the center. It's a right-wing party. So he's definitely going to have to make a broader alliance with at least more centrist forces in the Congress, because he only has 20% and it's a bicameral Congress like the U.S. It's the Senate and the Chamber of Representatives. But I do want to really briefly also say that, just echoing what Ajamu said, what Petro is trying to do here is trying to bring together different constituencies. And we were talking about the Congress. Well, a more important constituency, I think, for him to accomplish what he wants to accomplish are the social movements, because he understands that the political institutions in Colombia are very corrupt and they're very undemocratic. And the only way that things have really gotten done in the past several years is through these large protests. And ever since the current right-wing president, Ivan Duque, came to power in 2018, there have been constant protests. In 2019, 2020, and then last year were the largest protests. And that's why I think, Ajamu is absolutely right that Petro was basically forced to pick Francia Marquez, because although his political intuition tells him to kind of tack a little bit toward the right, toward the center, he had to pick Francia because he needed the support of the social movements, because in 2021, they came close to forcing the right-wing government of Duque to basically resign. I mean, we should understand how brutal the state repression was. At least 80 protesters were killed, according to official government statistics. Hundreds were wounded, including people who lost their eyesight, because the ESMAD, these are the anti-riot police. There's videos of them just being extremely brutal and using pellets in their guns and shooting people's eyes. And the violence was so brutal and the uprising was so widespread that Petro had to pick someone who represented the power of those social movements, basically saying that if you vote for me, I'm going to try to accomplish what the demands of the social movements were. So whether or not he's going to be able to do that in the Congress is, of course, I think the biggest obstacle he's going to face with only 20%. But he picked the right representative of the social movements in the figure of Francia.
I think that's also an interesting lesson for us here as we sit around twiddling our fingers, just asking nicely about getting some representation as leftists. I'm curious, when you mention that there's obviously extreme economic stratification, obviously that's a reality in much of the world, including the United States. But the extremity of it makes me curious about what is driving a significant portion of the population to find an appeal in the right-wing politics. Here, I would argue that there's some combination of, cultural issues and a kind of Reagan-style propaganda that makes people believe that simply creating better conditions for the affluent will trickle down to them. So that combined with fear-mongering about, trans kids or whatever the issue of the day is, keeps a lot of poor and working class people attracted to conservative politics, despite there not being any real benefit for them, combined with the fact that liberal politics also don't offer a great deal. What is the situation? What is the appeal of right-wing politics in Colombia?
I would say that it's very complex, and we got to remember this is an electorate that voted against the peace process a few years ago. But it could be explained in terms of generational contradictions. Colombia is still a very religious place, but it's also a place in which, as a consequence of the divisions that developed during the course of the last 5 decades of intense political struggles, guerrilla movements, there's a lot of anti-leftism in the culture. Directed, of course, against their own sort of internal leftists, if you will, but also, the symbolism or the relationship between the left in Colombia and the left in places like Venezuela and Cuba, it resonates. The idea that, okay, one of the things that the campaign had to deal with, of course, was that if the left won, they're going to transform Colombia into another Venezuela. And that resonated, especially when you have tens of thousands of Venezuelan refugees in the country. So is and remember, Colombia is a right-wing society, and so that kind of anti-leftism was very, very pronounced, and that's why you had some degree of support for the right, and lastly, corruption. These elections, the culture is such where basically, people give out favors and money and everything else. And some of that corruption also was reflected in the election in terms of turnout and what's happening in some of the rural parts of the country, where the state, along with the paramilitaries, basically suppressed the turnout. that's part of the story we need to talk about also too, because it was a courageous act on the part of people to come out in those communities where they were told basically you can't come out, can't come outdoors, as a matter of fact. And some people, in fact, defied that, and some people, in fact, lost their lives as a consequence.
Hey YouTube, thanks for watching. Just a reminder that this is a podcast. You can catch an extra premium episode every Monday for $5 a month at patreon.com/badfaithpodcast. That's patreon.com/badfaithpodcast for $5 a month, an extra episode every week. Additionally, please do consider liking this video, subscribing to this channel. It helps us out. It helps independent media beat the algorithm. We appreciate you. And as always, keep the faith.